Thank you very, very much for that introduction. Thank you so much to Victoria for wanting to come and join us in this digital space. I was thinking a little bit, and I think you were too, about the last time we were able to share an opportunity of speaking together, and it was at the Courtauld Institute a couple of years ago. And it is a great joy to be able to see so many people on this screen this evening as we explore together this question of sacred space and the way that sacred spaces, in my talk at least, particularly Christian spaces and modern Christian spaces, have spoken to us, whether someone is Christian or not, in the midst of lockdown. The reason why I wanted to talk about this is because there has been quite a lot of pressure from within and beyond the Church of England, which is the tradition that I come from and what I represent. And part of the pressure had to do with what the Church of England's decisions were, which I'm sure many of you are familiar with, after lockdown began in the UK on the 23rd of March for us, where we had to close the church doors and at least for a while, walk away. That was an obviously traumatic experience for many people in many different congregations for many reasons. We can speak a lot about churches as community hubs, about the phenomenon of gathering together and how it changes and transforms us. And out of this rose a quite significant debate about architecture. And as Ellis mentioned, I have this background in architectural history as an academic, as well as being a priest. So I was fascinated by what would happen when these things intersected. And what happened was a horrible Twitter argument that went on for weeks and weeks in a particular zone of Twitter, which I imagine very few of you occupy. If you don't know about this zone, please don't go there. It's filled with barbed wire and broken spirits. Anglican Twitter can be quite a bitchy and complicated place. And so this debate was something that grew out primarily of the relationship between architecture and the Eucharist. So what it is to gather together in that liturgical experience of being nourished by the body and blood of Christ together. So the huge trauma that people were experiencing, and everyone has been experiencing different forms of trauma throughout this pandemic. It's a very complex picture. This particular form of trauma was about not being able to be in the building and therefore not being able to share the Eucharist together. Everyone agreed that that was an incredibly sad and complex experience. However, out of that, broadly speaking, this is a simplification of a really complicated thing. Two groups who were quite binary in their thinking and quite diametrically opposed to one another, tribally started to duke it out online about what church was and what the church was or could be. And I saw and heard over and over again, the church is the people, not the building. And that's super interesting because there are a lot of words for church and words that are connected to how architecture and people group together in a specific way for worship and for sacred encounter with the numinous, with the ineffable space of sacred space, as Le Corbusier puts it, and he's coming. In a few minutes' time, perhaps will come up in the conversation Victoria and I will have later as well. So this massive debate grew up, and it was part of a bigger tribal question, which very, very unhelpfully, I suppose, could be categorized as those who have this big sense of sacramental theology and sacramental space, and those for whom maybe that is less of an issue. And so this question of what church is it the people? Is it the building? Is it both? Really started to upset me because it seemed to be utterly and completely the wrong question. And I have to be careful now because my training incumbent, the vicar of the parish, has just walked into the room. Can we get a Jeremy cameo? Hi. I have no idea if we agree on this issue. I bet we do, but I'll tell you about this later. So you got it. That's my boss. So this is really fun.
Everything you said, you know that.
Wow. Wow. Anyway, so I got really concerned about this because it was just the wrong question. Because there is no way that there truly is a tension that consistently exists between the places in which people gather and what the people are doing. We've gone through many iterations across architectural generations that have to do with style, certainly, and that also have to do with core theological questions, whether they're being asked by Roman Catholics, by Protestants, or whoever. We could think about this in terms of Muslims, Buddhists, and on it goes. And so that should be. It's important that we have those questions. However, that binary was incredibly destructive because it meant that a number of people said, our buildings don't matter. We could close the door and never come back, and it doesn't matter. And a number of people said, our buildings matter more than anything, and we have no idea how to connect with our people if it's not based in our building. So it was amazing, because that was kind of the scale. And when we look at online worship, that becomes extra complicated. So I'm gonna read you something from a little section of a book I quite like, about, it's a recent book about sacred space and kind of how it works. And this section is called The Victory of Sacred Failure. And I think there's something very interesting in the connection between architectural experimentation and the complexity of the failure of Jesus on the cross, which for Christians then becomes the triumphant resurrection and salvation of God for the whole world. So there's a theology and architecture thing that comes together very, very closely in this. So here's what McNamara has to say. Every new church in a new style is an experiment. Without the risks of experiments that fail, there is no creation. Perhaps people in the future will point to many failed experiments, but they will also point to wondrous success, the triumph over the dishonest, the unquestioned, the anxiously conservative. New church building is a victory of spirit, of the creative human spirit and of the Spirit of God that breaks into our weakness. So maybe that's something that we need the buildings for, that they reflect back to us, not a sense of triumph or perfection, but a sense of vulnerable, ongoing experimentation. I think that's one of the best things that church architecture can do. And something like that got completely lost in this debate. It simply was not interesting for Anglican clergy who started to really fight with one another about whether or not the buildings were important in this time of crisis. At this point, I'm going to share my screen and share some images with you. I sincerely hope this works. This is the classic Zoom thing. Can you please put your thumb up if you can see the PowerPoint presentation?
That works, Ayla. That's great.
It works. Excellent. And hopefully it will continue to work. And you get massive bonus points for knowing exactly not only what that is, the artwork that I'm showing you now on the title slide, but also where that is. If you already know, massive bonus points to you. If you don't, that's perfectly fine. You've lost nothing. It's okay. So as a good Gothic revivalist, I wanted to start here with this spectacular photo of All Saints Margaret Street. This, of course, was one of the churches that decided kind of not to close the door and decided to continue to have services, as in fact many churches did. On Easter Sunday, the Archbishop of Canterbury celebrated the Eucharist from his kitchen in Lambeth. And that really caused these problems in a variety of different ways as a part of this debate. And it was also one of the things that kept a number of clergy who wanted to be in their building and who wanted to have the Eucharist together in some kind of way that kept them going. Eventually, the Archbishop of Canterbury, Justin Welby, said that the instruction, and language is really important here, the instruction that had been given that everyone should leave their churches was in fact a kind of strong guidance, but not an instruction. And then of course, everybody freaked out all over again. So it's a very complex, very nuanced picture over these weeks of difficulty. So the great thing about William Butterfield's All Saints Margaret Street is that it tells a story in such a vigorous way. Just behind the high altar, this incredible painted reredos by William Dyce, and then painted over, but very, very similarly by Ninian Comper in the early 20th century, tells the story of the birth, death, resurrection, and triumphant reigning in majesty of Christ. The ceiling you can see there in the chancel, also by Comper, contains images of the Arma Christi. So the images, these symbols that are connected to the crucifixion and the passion. This building teaches and it teaches very, very loudly. It teaches something about the triumphalism of Victorian Gothic and its followers, and that kind of sacramental theology that comes along with that. It also teaches genuinely aggressively. And in the early 20th century, the architect Harry Stewart Goodhart Rendell said that of this building, it wasn't meant to be polite. It wasn't meant to be subtle. It yells at you that this is the house of God, but also that these are the things that you need to know about God. This is the story of God, and this is how it is laid out for you, piece by piece in this building. You can read this building in such a legible way. It's open to interpretation, but not in the same way that modernist church architecture is open to a different kind of expansive interpretation. And so that made me think about the light of the world, because William Holman Hunt's Light of the World, there are several versions of this, there are 3, and the oldest is in Keble College Chapel in Oxford, which is also a William Butterfield design. The interesting thing about the light of the world for me, I think, is that there is this image of Christ knocking on the closed door of what is meant to be a human heart, a human soul, a human conscience, and the door is utterly overgrown. And I think this image gives us some sense of the anxiety that a number of clergy were feeling when lockdown happened and the doors were shut, and they thought, my God, the people of God are suddenly standing outside this locked door. Jesus himself is perhaps standing outside this locked door. If we close our churches, are we closing ourselves off to this essential experience, not only of gathering, but also of being together in a holy, consecrated place where the body of Christ is manifested in the Eucharist, is known, is present? I think there was a deep anxiety about whether or not, in closing the doors, there had been something like a betrayal of Christ himself. I haven't heard any priest describe it like that, but if I was to go there with a number of my colleagues, I really, really think that there would be some positive and some complex answers that might come back from that. I'm showing you here as well St. Paul's Cathedral, which is where the big version of Holman Hunt's Light of the World is, the one that went round the British Empire. And this is a new architectural project, which is takes £2 million to make this happen, so it has not happened yet. And it's a proposed memorial, a miniature chapel of a kind inside St. Paul's Cathedral that includes a digital element, and it's specifically for those who have lost loved ones due to COVID-19. So this enormous online response that St. Paul's Cathedral has been spearheading is something that now potentially will have this architectural manifestation. So at the very time that the cathedral was shut, it became clear that the church in the world had to do something digitally. And now, as the churches are starting to open again, there's an idea that those things could come back together, and that the digital project could inhabit the cathedral in an architectural way. That's fascinating. We haven't seen many examples of that, if ever. And so St. Paul's is being really creative in a way which could be really positive and bear a lot of fruit. This is my own church. For those of you who've not been inside St. John at Hampstead, it's pretty nice. It's a beautiful neoclassical building from the mid-18th century that was expanded, and that's what you can see in the chancel and high altar area in the late 19th century. This church is an amazing metaphor because in the late 19th century, they decided to turn the whole thing 180 degrees liturgically because they needed more space for a bigger congregation. So west liturgically is in fact east, and east liturgically is in fact west. The church used to be the right way round, and then the congregation decided to turn it. And I tell you what, I would not have wanted to be at that committee meeting. It was really grim. And there were also questions about the tower. William Morris and a number of people got involved, saying that this should stay as it is. This church has been the center of controversy in all kinds of fascinating ways. On the right, you see not only the chancel, but a lonely tripod in the chancel. I have presided at the Eucharist in front of a lonely tripod in an empty church many weeks. Across the last few months, it's been one of the most painful experiences that I have ever had. Spiritual communion reminds us consistently of the power of architecture. It reminds us of the power of God, certainly. It reminds us of the hope of coming together. But the longing isn't just about the longing that has to do with gathering together physically. It has to do with the architectural space itself. For a while, we had to do this at home. So I had to set up my living room like some crazy chapel. My husband is a television producer, and so thankfully he was able to make it work. My husband is also an atheist. I felt so bad, like so bad, that there was no alternative other than for him to help out with this. And so that's what happened. And that was painful too, to be separated doubly from the building and from the people, and yet to continue somehow to partake in the Eucharist on behalf of the people. So when it was possible to come back into church, someone reflected back to me that even though they were still watching online, it was better because they could hear church. What they meant was that the acoustic of my voice in the building was what they remembered from what we could hear when we could gather in the building together. The flat acoustic of my home is completely different from what was possible here. And she was very moved. And the best way that she could put it is, it sounds like church. And I thought that that in itself was a very important thing. Architects work with acoustics all the time. We have to think about the way that space and light are being shaped in a sacred space of any style all the time, in order to understand how the numinous, how the ineffable is being captured, or at least being activated in these buildings of very different kinds. When we were able to start to come back into church as a group, the first thing I was able to say to people with tears in my eyes was, welcome home. And when I say this to you now, I feel like I'm gonna cry. And part of the reason is that this is a spiritual home, but it's also a physical home in some extraordinary ways for people, because worship is embodied. And one of the first people that I let back into the building is a guy named Steve, who is around and comes in and sits in the church most days. And I was so happy to see him. And I was so happy to see him, not because he's one of our regular Sunday worshipers, but because he is present. His presence indicated to me that this church building was active again. And here I'm just showing you two examples of what the church is like. On the left, an amazing arts and crafts window by the artist Joan Fulilove, who was also a suffragist and who lived next door. Under-researched, amazing person. And then I'm showing you an image of Our Lady Chapel there, and the frontal on the Lady Chapel is our COVID-19 altar frontal, temporary. People in their homes made little textile squares, and then a woman in the parish gathered them all, put them together, and then presented them. And one of them says, stay alert to God. One of them is a rainbow with lots of little knots of thread that represent the congregation. They're extremely moving. I could talk to you for an hour about this, but I'm not going to. So even in isolation, relatively speaking, things were being added into church, because the church is where we belong, even though we could belong with God anywhere. I wanted to show you this project too, which was done by an artist called J.P. Flintoff. He's an artist and a writer. He's got a really good website. You can look him up. He'd be so happy I said that. And he did this project called Be Drawn. And here are just three quick examples. Anna on the left, who I'll tell you about a little bit more later. Nigel in the center with stained glass light through a window reflecting off the pew and the side of his face. And Maureen, our children and youth worker, who chose to be drawn in the children's chapel, where all the children's activities tend to be set up. When JP did this project, he asked each person, where in the church would you like to be drawn? People had never thought about this before. They thought, why am I comfortable here and not here? Why do I want to be here? Because maybe you have a certain pattern. If you come to a certain place, you always sit in a certain chair. You experience something from a particular angle, but that isn't what people did. People used it as an opportunity to get in touch with their building in a completely new way, because they had the freedom to do so. And so Anna was drawn in the sanctuary. This is right next to the altar. She's never been there before. You know, why would she go up there? But that's what she chose to do. And she chose to do it because of the inscription just behind her, which is in some really beautiful woodwork. You'll just have to believe me that this is what it says. And it's the words of Jesus from John. I am the vine, you are the branches. I am the vine, you are the branches. So she was asked to talk about what it was like and why she chose that place. And she said, I like that it said, we are branches of a tree, or words to that effect, as it reminds me of the trees around London, which we pass throughout our lives, and how many lives they have seen grow from birth to death, much like God does, silently, quietly, but diligently watching over us and taking care of us. She sees God in London, and she sees God in the trees, and she sees God in the metaphor, and she sees God at the altar. And so that comes together in this phrase of Jesus, which is just present to us in this 19th century design. And that's what she deeply wanted to have reflected. I also wanted to talk a little bit about change and transformation. On the left, you have St. Peter's Lutheran Church in New York City in the 19th century. And then you have what happened next in the 1970s, when the land was so attractive to a huge bank in Manhattan that they did a deal with the church. And so the church decided to work with an architecture company, and the architecture firm wanted to express St. Peter as a saint in a different way. And so they made the whole church like a rock in Manhattan. And then the idea of the rock, which is both open to the world and also this sort of, big geometrical form, which didn't necessarily say church, but it certainly didn't say bank. It didn't say skyscraper. It's saying something else in the 1970s. And what they wanted to do was to express in architecture that the church is being anchored in that place, and it was not replaced, it was transformed. And I think that's a really important metaphor for us when we think about what has happened here in lockdown. The church hasn't been replaced, it's been transformed. And it's helping us always to be able to understand what is most important to us at any given moment and why. That, and when church doors are closed, churches always speak to us anyway. Sacred space is talking to us if we never go in. You may never have been inside the Church of St. Peter in New York City, but if you walk past it, it would do something to you architecturally, like any building does. So these buildings on the landscape are never truly shut as such, because they are always present as part of our built environment, as part of our shared cultural fabric. So even if you can't get in, that church is still speaking to you. And I think that was another lesson from lockdown. And this just to show you some of the stuff inside that church. This is one of Louise Nevelson's sculptures from the Chapel of the Good Shepherd, recently restored. Really, really exciting stuff. We are no longer in the Gothic revival. There is a different moment here in the 1970s. And here's my little Breuer moment. So there's some beautiful stained glass there, which we're seeing from a different angle in Victoria's background. And I wanted to think a little bit about light by comparing it very briefly with Patrick Renchien's and John Piper's stained glass in the baptistry at Coventry Cathedral. So it's never just about concrete, about stained glass on its own. It's about the way that these things come together. It's about the relationship between sculpting with light, sculpting with imagination, and sculpting with form. And I think we always have those things held in tension in church buildings, no matter what they look like. Style is so important. Sacred affect comes through any style if it is handled by an architect and an artist and a patron, a client, with care. So if you put God first, you're going to be fine. And that's what these things do. So on the left is Ian Hamilton Finley's L'étoile dans son étable de lumière. So the star in his stable of light. And this is the installation at St. Paul's Cathedral. I was involved with this project a few years ago. Fortunately, it happened just before Brexit. And so everybody was like, it's in French. Is the cathedral making some kind of European statement? No, it was just an interesting coincidence. And here we have a little image of the incredible stained glass in one of the niches at Le Corbusier's chapel in Ronchamp, right? You're like nodding heads, you all know what this is. And there it is, Étoile du matin, the morning star. The morning star rises in the glass. And I love this idea of the star in his stable of light, because it is unstable. The stable itself is this vulnerable temporary place for the birth of the Son of God. However, the stable is also a sense of the stability of our church architecture, all of which will crumble away one day, just like we will. And so I love the way that Hamilton Finley has made étable in a really different color, so that the star and the light are in this yellow on either side of the stable, which is stable and unstable. And of course, neon and light is like that too. You switch it on, you switch it off. It's a really friable, kind of fragmentary thing, like glass is breakable. And I love this idea of not clinging on constantly and tenaciously to things that we pretend are permanent. None of this stuff is permanent. And I think that lockdown taught us about that as well, and taught us about what we value and why, about what we do and what we don't have at any given moment. And so briefly then, I wanted to think as well about altars. And here is the altar that by Ninian Comper in Pusey House on one side, and here is the altar in Neil McLaughlin's chapel for Cuddesdon College in Oxford on the other side. Here, these buildings are doing completely different things, but both of them will not survive architecturally unless the altar of the sacrament of God is in the center. And Comper in particular believed that as long as you got your altar right and your understanding of the altar of God right, the rest of it would fall into place. That was your beginning. That's your beginning and your end point. And so finally, here we are back at the tripod, and here we are back at things that are stable and unstable. It has been a really hard few months for all of us. Inside and outside our churches, I think what we discovered is not that church is the people, not the building, but that the interconnectedness between people and buildings is more powerful and more visceral than we realized. Way more powerful and more visceral than we realized. I've learned so much about my community by listening attentively in a different way as an architectural historian, as well as a priest, listening to how they miss this building and how they use this building and how God touches them in this space. When it's shut, when it's open, whatever it is, these buildings are always teaching us. Thanks so much. I'm gonna hand over to Victoria.
Wow, thank you, Ayla. It's so interesting to hear you talk about this as a celebrant of these spaces. I've been thinking a lot about you this weekend, and look forward to having a conversation about that later. So really, and so fantastic to see some of those images in your presentation. I have the great fortune of teaching at the University of St. Thomas in St. Paul, Minnesota, but teaching in London every second January. And it's great to spend a whole month there, and I take the kids around, the students around, to see a lot of these spaces. And I just wanted us to think about, you know, the nature of sacred space. So I'm going to go ahead and share some images with you all. And thanks to Ellis and the Architecture Foundation for having me as part of this, Ayla, for the invite. It's really good for me to be here with you. So here is a look at what I'd like to share with you. All right, and images, good. Everybody, thanks, Ayla.
Yeah, you're not full screen yet.
Here we go. Yep, it's coming. There, how's that? Everybody good?
Yep.
All right. So I was traveling recently, and if your pictures are running all down the side, you can minimize that so you don't see that. You can catch the whole image. I had to take a little time away last week just to regroup after kind of an intense period, as we've all been going through. And I went to the North Shore of Minnesota, up on Lake Superior. Almost to Canada is where this is located. Of course, the border's locked down there. But this is in Grand Portage, and this is a little chapel that was built by French Catholic missionaries coming into the region, particularly Christianizing the Ojibwe who lived here, and making this connection kind of through Montreal and all the way back to Europe. But I just, you know, it made me think so much about just what the sacred means, and particularly a building like this that was closed, like so many buildings are, but these sites that can take on so many different forms, you know, that can be super high style, that can be built by settlers, you know, or log cabins basically. But sacred buildings have this incredible way of providing a space for us to organize ourselves with regard to religion, to have this function that inherently lets those practices, those rituals be made manifest. And, you know, the history of architecture has been concerned with religious building probably more than anything throughout time. In past cultures, the universal and exalted appeal of religion made the church or the mosque or the synagogue or what have you, the temple, the most expressive, the most permanent, the most powerful building in a landscape. And it's no different here in Grand Portage, Minnesota, which still has remnants of its original settlement fort down the hill, but this is up on top of the hill, and it's the only thing that's painted white, you know, so it it's mattered for a long, long time. And, you know, I also wanted to share, I'm sure you all know this, the wonderful interior of St. Stephen's Wallbreak by Christopher Wren. But every time I come back to London to teach or to visit or whatever, I find myself in this space. And it's Wren, and it's those things Ayla was talking about, the light, you know, the kind of majesty, the altar, that amazing altar by Henry Moore. And our friend Timothy Hyde has done some fantastic work on how that came to be part of it. But it's here, you know, where this ritual is performed and these hierarchy of spaces sustain that ritual. And, you know, we can have this symbolic performance that acts out communal worship, prayer, individuals, meditation, sacrifice, pilgrimage, whatever it might be. And I was thinking too a lot about the role of the human body in these spaces and the kinds of things that impact us as we're a member of or participating in a ritual, the motions we make, the movements, the way we listen, the way we smell things. And so this connection of the individual to the broader community is something that comes up as part of these wonderful buildings. And also recently was in Salisbury Cathedral. And I just, you know, think about this space as, you know, this kind of wonderful notion of the church building that shelters the activity of the congregants within this, that informs and forms a spirit of community as well, and reinforces a common mindset, a common ideal. It's a great moment of capturing a culture, which is so powerful. And artistic elements make a difference too, but it's this real commitment to a higher power by our community that comes through in buildings like this. And of course, as Ayla was mentioning about style, there's no one style for a building, and we see the same style being used in every type of sacred space. You know, so it just, it's, you know, there's no, the thing about the church is there's not really, or the sacred, in any religious doctrine, there's no prescribed form for it. There's some indications of things, but as you look at this, and maybe I'll just, you know, this is a prairie school church here in Minneapolis done by some disciples of Frank Lloyd Wright. Of course, it's the interior of the Sainte-Chapelle. This is a synagogue in St. Paul here by Eric Mendelsohn, the Podella Palace, the U.S. Air Force Academy, the you know, wonderful site at Assisi. And this is the interior of a mosque in Turkey, the Sakarine Mosque, that was designed by a woman about 10 years ago. And it's just really interesting to think that our landscape of this sacred is so incredibly varied. So, you know, what happens next? Let me just go back here to this. So at the heart, like I said, at the heart of religion is a community coming together, people coming to worship, to pray, to care for one another, to eat together. So there's something incredibly antithetical about what's going on right now in our world and the COVID-19, you know, lockdown. It's difficult, it's counterintuitive, it's countercultural to be doing what we've been doing. And this is the chapel on my campus, University of St. Thomas here in St. Paul, Minnesota, done by Emmanuel Masqueret, who was a French emigre to this country through the École des Beaux-Arts, discovered by our local archbishop at the St. Louis World's Fair in 1904, and then came here and did many religious buildings for Archbishop John Ireland. But if you think back to 9/11, that next Sunday, September 16th, was one of the most attended religious services ever across the world, across all faiths. You know, we need that connection. So then what happens when we don't have this moment anymore? And we have these moments when, like Ayla's lonely tripod, there's my friend Father Larry Blake in our chapel down in the basement of the St. Thomas Aquinas Chapel. All of a sudden, the priest, the person behind the computer with the tripod and the camera became essential personnel on campus. We're not fully open yet. We won't do so for a couple of weeks. And then eventually on the right, what you're seeing there is a socially distanced mass where now only so many people can be in the building. And so this change is so powerful going on. And here's Breuer. This is a building I spent a lot of time working on, St. John's Abbey Church up in Collegeville. That great wall, you saw the window. Thanks, Ayla, for putting that in. I appreciate that. And, you know, the thing about a church building for architects is I think, really exciting for them to do it. Breuer was a guy who hadn't done a sacred space before he got this commission. And this was a Benedictine abbey, the largest in the world, trying to make this incredible statement in the years after World War II. Breuer's so interesting though, because he never talks about style. And I just want to read you a little bit of what he wrote about sacred space. This is how he thought about sacred space. He said, the church has never been a building. Oh, excuse me. He says, I have the feeling, and this is not a very clear-cut program or idea, that any space which is larger than necessary and higher than necessary, and which the structure and the whole building of space is visible, as it is in all churches, that this space created is simply automatically religious. I think that any large space which is built so the process of construction is visible on the inside is a religious space. So you're probably going, well, that doesn't really say much, but it actually says a lot in the sense that it's about these changes in the sacredness of space built to be that, and not a room in your home that's been transitioned into a makeshift religious space. It's about breadth and height and space. And it's also about engineered architecture, which was very important here, which if you think back to the Middle Ages is exactly what that was all about. So of course, now we adapt. Here's a clip I took off the Abbey's live stream from one of their prayer services. And this virtual worship takes over. So what are we losing? We're losing our time in that space, but we're losing the senses. We're trying to figure out, what our own accoutrements are for a mass that we need. How do we, keep the dog and the toddler at bay? How do you, keep the delivery man from not knocking at the door? So it's been really interesting. And this is, of course, something I'd like to talk with Ayla more about as a celebrant. And then this kind of blow up of these individual meditation sites and things like that, Instagram feeds, praying the rosary, support groups, faith groups. I mean, the transition has been pretty fast, including things like outdoor masses. This happened just across the river over in Baldwin, Minnesota, but this has been going on a lot. And drive-in masses aren't new. I mean, we could, see those kind of in the car era of the mid-century as well. But, in times of great anxiety, our leaders of all faiths have this opportunity, and I'd say this responsibility to really step up and provide this moment to draw on the depth of their sacred traditions and texts, but to change those. So there have been car mitzvahs in LA that have been going on, lots of outdoor masses. Even the traditional Hajj has been impacted this year. The image down at the bottom is what's going on, or what happened a couple weeks ago, last week actually, as the Saudi Arabians really cut down on who could attend versus what normally happens. I was reading about some kind of drive-by Hajjs that were being done in Maryland. So that's really interesting to think about that transition. And the other thing I think about too, this is of course the Vatican with Pope Francis on a screen out in the courtyard there at St. Peter's. But there's a financial element here as well. I was thinking about this drastic drop in tourists and pilgrims. And, in any kind of walk of life right now, we're thinking about the finances of things. And so how does that impact a church? How does a sacred entity survive through this, and how do they change? So then what happens too when, even in the kind of hierarchy of Christian celebrations, so this is Catholic in particular, the images on the left, down here, this is our great cathedral. This is a masquerade building in St. Paul. And this is a confirmation mass, the kind of adult passage in the Catholic Church, fully loaded in non-COVID times. And here in these other images, my son was confirmed recently in his own home parish church with numbers where the family sat, and social distancing and sanitizing and everything. And it was really interesting to me to think about, even within the rituals that go on in any particular faith, we expect certain things from our buildings to uplift something like confirmation. That's one of the 7 sacraments of the Catholic Church. So these moments, and here we are, right? Wearing masks to church, sanitizing churches, watching services on our phones, broadcasting, marketing them, getting sponsors to market them. I find this all incredibly fascinating. And the other thing that's happened too is that the church has been used for political purposes during everything that's gone on with COVID-19, but then particularly after the murder of George Floyd here in Minneapolis, with our president going in front of a church, St. John's Church, the church that are across Lafayette Square from the White House that most of our presidents attend. He doesn't attend this church regularly. To have a photo op after the path had been cleared with tear gas because there was a lot of protests going on after the murder of George Floyd. And look at that church, completely boarded up. And the local archbishop, she had no idea he was doing this. So this was super interesting. And then, of course, the murder of George Floyd in Minneapolis, that was, I think, you know, kind of one of the first times that we started to see the interiors again in a way that became part of a civil religion of sorts. Trump's doing the same thing, but the image on the bottom right is that funeral service at a local university here in town in their worship space. And then the other two images are that chapel of St. Thomas Aquinas at my institution, where our priests set up a memorial mass for George Floyd and kind of a mini altar. So, you know, just this way that all of this kind of ends up coming together in different ways. So, you know, just to kind of wrap up here and to get into a discussion, which I'm excited to do, architect Thomas Bender in 1991 in an essay he called Making Places Sacred said that they're physically powerful, often historically significant. They're places of delineation where limits are set spatially and through use. And Bender also believes that the sacred is an outcome of enlightened building. So, you know, for us, this architecture forces us to think about a different world, a meaningful world. It's full of beauty, the sensations, the feeling, how artists and architects have communicated this divine relationship to theology. And of course, we all react differently to this multi-sensory experience. We're talking about sound and light and smell and the decorum of being in a sacred space. Do you act differently within it? And what does that all mean? And will we be worshiping like this with someone right next to us going forward? And I'll just leave with this, as Ayla was talking about, you know, some work of contemporary, we were talking about this before we got on the call, this kind of notion of what's going on in church building. And I'm thinking a lot about this right now. These are done by a local firm called Hamel Green and Abramson, this little studio within the firm, John Serrano and Joan Cook. Joan is the designer of these spaces. And I keep thinking about, you know, kind of the future of these spaces, because it's not only that we're not in them, it's that financially so many other things are impacting our life. And how are we as a community going to kind of address how we move forward? Will the virtual, would a modified virtual, like what is enough? What is the right place for us to be? And I do believe that it's in these buildings.
Thank you, Victoria. That's fantastic. How should we play this? If people have questions, perhaps kind of, or just comments, just pitch your name in the box, in the chat box to the side, and I'll flag you up and unmute you. I mean, to kick off. I mean, I've been intrigued. Ayla, you showed this image I hadn't seen before of the project in St. Paul's for a memorial chapel for people who died in the course of COVID. And I guess I was wondering about what other sorts of longer term architectural consequences of a similar sort of ambition we might find. I mean, one doesn't have to walk far to see the monument to the after the Great Fire of London, kind of which is sort of marking it's an act of thanks, I guess, to God for the release from the fire. Do both of you see? Do you envisage that there will be an architectural legacy of chapels dedicated to this moment?
I would like to hope that there would be an enormous amount of imaginative, creative possibility. I am also very aware, as we all are, that financial pressures are such and architectural projects are such that let's build something is an utterly beautiful idea. And then the next question is how? With what money? In what way? And so I love that you've brought up monument and the monument in the city of London as an example, because of course, I mean, the city was utterly decimated and that had an enormous economic impact. And yet, eventually, there is this structure of hope. And we could think about that in terms of St. Paul's Cathedral itself, though in very different circumstances. And on the pediment, on the south side of the cathedral, there is this phoenix-like image, and above it says Resurgam. So we have so many examples just within, you know, a 10-minute walk that helps us to imagine how architectural responses to our pandemic trauma might become possibilities. But I'm pretty concerned that just in my own little world anyway, there is an immense amount of conservatism anyway, generally. Maybe that's not fair, but that's what I see over and over again. But I wonder whether or not a good example of what could come out of it might be temporary projects as well. Something that could really unleash the creativity of a number of architects who have also been affected, no doubt financially, by this experience, that might in some way capture for a moment or an extended moment this experience of constant flux. Anyway, I can really imagine, say, something similar to the V&A's one-to-one project where they had 7 tiny pavilions that were inside the museum. You can go inside this miniature treehouse or whatever it was. And that was a really powerful thing. And maybe that's an interesting way forward.
And have we, I mean, I guess a lot of the conversation was really about the focus on the experience of being within a church. But obviously, some of the buildings you were showing are very explicitly evangelical in ambition. I guess there's, you know, some Mary's, the Butterfield churches, particularly, perhaps. I mean, we noticed, I think, kind of when we were working on Congregation, which was an exhibition of that wasn't exclusively of Christian buildings, that the perhaps some of the new faith spaces that were being built by other religions were much more explicitly exotic presences in the city and explicitly evangelical, perhaps, in intent. The new architecture that was being made, Christian architecture that was being made, was much less emphatic about its presence in the city. I mean, how have you, do you draw a distinction between the kind of your pastoral function, your evangelical function as a kind of priest, and between the way that, how do you see that as having shifted in the course of the last kind of, you know, 3 or 4 months? Has it kind of changed that evangelical mission kind of in the context of working on Zoom calls?
Okay, I love this. I particularly love this because I can see one of my parishioners in this call right now.
Oh,
so
good.
Sheena, if I get this wrong, you just tell me, yeah? As a user of this experience, as someone who's been on the receiving end a lot. One thing I would say beforehand is that your use of the word evangelical is really making me laugh, because that's also a particular kind of way of doing things and way of being together within the Church of England, right? And All Saints Margaret Street is the opposite. It's Anglo-Catholic. So there's something about the way those words are being used. But I think that the way you're using it is that it has to do with outreach and a kind of an architectural articulacy about what the building is, what it's meant to do, who it's for, who's meant to come in, and how that presence is a presence which is about a really specific set of symbols being drawn upon in a way that's really legible, whether it's legible for the people who would naturally come in and make use of that space as worshipers, or legible for those who might be of a different faith or no faith, but can walk by it and say, okay, that's a mosque, that's a Hindu temple, whatever it is. I think that's interesting. We know that there are plenty of examples of Christian spaces and spaces of other faiths that don't necessarily declare explicitly that that's what they are, and that that's a really positive thing. Like, that's actually quite good, because that's an opportunity for radical experimentation, and we could think of many examples, especially after, say, 1915, 1920. I'll just put a marker down there. That said, I think that that, unfortunately, is a safe place for a conservative, boring, unfortunate architecture to hide. I really do. That a lot of the time, architectural examples I can think of which are not very inspiring, not very imaginative, perhaps coming from a point of view of being embarrassed about being seen to be a church, or attractive because it doesn't look like a church, it looks like a shop, or it looks like a mall, or it looks like a swimming pool, or whatever it is. I suspect that that's sort of the not very helpful, and this is only my own view, outcomes of a rise of a certain kind of modernism, where it's not that style is being experimented with in an exciting way that gives rise to new expression, but it's that a pursuit of an ahistorical stylist thing, which was all silly anyway, but that was the idea, and like a deeply held narrative has been taken up by a certain form of Christian architecture, driven by clients, I think, a lot of the time, that says, oh, well, we don't have to build something that looks like a church, because what does a church look like anyway? And if you combine that with either a very deep sense of wanting to be present in the community, which is good, with a very, I don't know, I don't want to be mean about my sisters and brothers, but I'm sure it's safe in here, right? You're recording this is going online. I can also see another colleague of mine who's like, what are you talking about? But I know he's on my side, so I'm fine. That there's something really concerning about the association of that kind of non-declaring architecture with the very same people who are saying over and over again, it's not the building, it's the people. It's almost like an architecture that denies the function of the building. And that I just don't get.
And by extension, are you optimistic about this new world of Zoom services? And more broadly, sort of having an internet presence. Can that be more inclusive? Can that be more accommodating to people who might, be turned off by what I was describing as the evangelical qualities of church architecture?
That's not what we've experienced. But what we have experienced is that people who would find it difficult to get to church anyway, who would like to be at church but can't be at church because they're shielding, because they are differently abled, because they're not sure about whether or not they're fully welcome. They're coming because there's something radically democratic, as well as being radically annoying and dissatisfying about Zoom. And so we've seen that. Pastorally, it's been really interesting because it's possible to meet with people in a way which is simultaneously intensive and yet remote. And that's been very positive for people. I think that our community hasn't lost any of its spiritual quality, but we have really, really longed for being in a building that teaches us about holiness and teaches us about togetherness with God in a particular way.
We have a comment or question from Christopher Irvin, which kind of builds on that. Christopher, I'm going to unmute you.
Thank you very much. Well, thank you both for absolute marvellous presentations. Like Ayla, I'm also a practitioner. And practicing in a rural context with rural church buildings, which I've discovered are just so significant in the lives of rural communities in terms of identity and being a kind of taproot into the history, almost the building itself being a palimpsest of that community. But the question I want to ask is, yes, of course, there are different architectural forms, but what is it that makes the worshipping space a kind of holy space? I've heard recently that there is a sense in which this holiness can be palpable. You can feel it. An architectural historian Nicola Coldstream, I was in conversation with the other day, saying, yeah, we know it's a holy place when you walk into it. And I just wonder if, particularly Ayla might have something to give us on that particular quandary. If you want an example, I once knew a holy place and a place where perhaps I learnt to pray, and that space stopped being a holy place. It was no longer a church. And when I went back and visited the building, it didn't feel, it was the same building, but it didn't evoke the same disposition, as it were, in me. The Shekinah had lifted and gone. So what is it that actually makes that the holy place? Is it those who gather and physically gather and invoke the name of the triune God, and therefore make that building a sort of laboratory of the Spirit? Just how, what is it? What is that quality that can even touch an agnostic poet like Philip Larkin?
Yeah. I think that the relationship between liturgy and architecture and intention and intuition and prayer and hope and sorrow and joy creates this extraordinary cocktail which no one can control. And I think that you just know, I think Nicola's right. I think all of us have had experiences in different ways, and it doesn't matter what faith you are. There will be something that happens to you when you go in a building and there's some sense of deep overwhelm by a presence that you can't name. So that this idea of the ineffable that Le Corbusier and others are so interested in, I think that's really vital. I was thinking when you were speaking about consecrated spaces and deconsecrated spaces.
Yeah.
And I think one of the things about blessing is that when we bless something like a building or people or an object in holy use, we are saying, God is in everything. This is for a sacred purpose. And when you deconsecrate something and your church becomes some flats or a Tesco or whatever, then you still have that church building. My favorite one is a mattress store, which I saw in Wales all the time. I often think about the chapel that was turned into a mattress store, and I think, wow. And I think that chapel or that church is still working in that space. It's still speaking in the landscape.
Yeah. It's interesting, isn't it? I mean, you referred to Tesco. Tesco was open. Our churches were shut. The people who were stacking shelves in Tesco were regarded as being key workers. Mm-hmm. Those who perhaps, perform the purpose for which these churches are built, therefore, by implication, are not key workers.
Victoria, because of what you had to say about when people were coming back to campus and how priests were working with that community remotely, and Christopher's first question about what makes worship space a holy place, I would love to hear your perspective on both those things.
Well, I was just thinking about, as you were answering this last question, what Breuer said when he attended one of the 2 consecration masses, and that's the building behind me here too. And I think about this question a lot because this is a very modern building with lots of concrete and not a lot of decoration, and traditional architectural historians and architects, and our friend Dennis McNamara, who I think you were quoting at the start, Ayla. We went to graduate school together, and Dennis was very traditional and I was working on this building. So we've had lots of long talks about this, but Breuer said to the abbot, and this has always fascinated me, and I know this is working on an architect level, but I think it applies across the scheme and hopefully answers your question in a different way. He said to the abbot, this was such a powerful experience for me. I've never had a building made sacred in front of my eyes. And I think as a designer, that must just be the bee's knees, just to be in there. And you've done something extraordinary. And, I talked about him liking space and breath and engineering principles and design, but to sit there through a ritual that made that building something more than he already thought it was good enough being sacred. Like that for me was just an extraordinary moment to find that.
We're going to have one more question, but we're going to have to keep it quite compact because we have another session, kind of which we're going to line up. But Gilbert Sungera, I'm going to unmute you. Gilbert, are you there? No. Oh, oh, there we go.
Okay. Again, I'm a Jesuit priest as well as a consultant on sacred space, but I'm curious about the notion of the virtual community that gathers at Eucharist in every, at least in Roman Catholic and Anglican worship, that comes together, that's present. And is there a linkage between the virtual community set up by Zoom and all these other calls or other systems that can integrate? Because I'd imagine, at least here in the United States, we're looking for at least a year and a half of these kind of hybrid worship services. So if there's any thoughts on what makes the virtual community present in sacred spaces in general.
I'm so glad that you're speaking about this, because this is on my mind all the time. It's what the staff group here are speaking about all the time. And one of the main fears that we had when it became possible to return to our churches for socially distanced and COVID-safe worship is that there would be a number of people who could come, and that's great, and a number of people who could or would not come, who would be online. And then does that create what the Church Times inelegantly referred to as a two-tier system? And so we decided that we weren't going to open up our main Sunday service in the church itself. We've kept it online. Meanwhile, we have an earlier service at 8 o'clock, which is still broadcast on Facebook Live. Everything we do is still online for anyone who wants to come digitally, virtually. And that is communion. And we kept it very simple, just said no music at all, Book of Common Prayer early in the morning, because that's part of our tradition anyway. So our 8 o'clock service is now open for people to come in a safe way. Our 10:30 service has remained online while we figure out, like, we needed time to deliberate what kind of integrative approach would be possible. And the big question that I have is how we encourage fuller or fullest participation in worship when those who cannot be there are still spiritually and digitally present, because that presence is just as important. So there's a possibility that we can, our audio systems are pretty interesting and we can do cool stuff. So not just have a screen with a grid, but we can have someone's voice coming through our sort of speaker system. And we know in one way or another whose voice is that voice. And they come and they minister to us as that voice. We can do things with screens, but I don't think that that's our full story. And I don't think that that's the option that we should be leaning on all the time. What I do think is that whatever we do, if we don't walk together, it will cause enormous pain. And I would rather go slow and integrate than go too quickly and have people feel that they are in some way accidentally excluded or not seen or not valued. I don't want to put her on the spot, but Sheena, as a Hampstead Parish Church parishioner, do you have a response to this and what it's been like for you?
Sheena's going to have to unmute herself.
I think the Zoom experience has been very valuable because that's what we had. But I think it's been very precious to be able to actually go back into the building. And what's been quite interesting is as the building gradually became alive, I think the first time I went in, it still actually felt quite empty. Whereas now there is this feeling of it's actually starting to come alive again. And I've got a story of a friend. Can I tell you this? This is a friend of mine who's very unwell. She's in a lot of pain. She's quite elderly. And she came to the 8 o'clock the other day and she said, I can't do with Zoom. It's not holy. So she makes this tremendous effort to come to the 8 o'clock. And even when the building was closed, she got her partner to drive past so she could sit in the churchyard and be in the space of the building. I think the building is incredibly important. I think Zoom is a bit two-dimensional, and there's something about, you know, being in a 3D space. I don't know if that addresses what you're thinking about.
Thank you. It does. Thanks so much.
Yeah, it's interesting. And I think too, a lot of churches around here are taking reservations for services, which is also another layer on this.
We're not
So,
that popular.